Alrighty, so welcome. I am Liz, one of the reference librarians at Dairy, and welcome to the film program on Black filmmakers. This is obviously in honor of Black History Month, and partially because, again, I love film, but as I started to go through the classics and kind of see the who's who of the creatives, what directors you should watch, I found that with a few exceptions, all of the directors were white men. The exceptions usually being masters of Japanese cinema like Kurosawa and Ozu. So I've always been interested in other storytellers in film. And actually, I should mention next month is going to be female directors. It's going to be a long program. I'm going to have to figure out how to condense that. Just as actually condensing this was hard because I initially had the conception that Black filmmakers were relatively new to the genre. And while they didn't have as many opportunities at the birth of cinema as others did, they certainly were around for it. So this is also a fun program to research as well. But I do think that if we're looking at you know, Black history and the history of cinema, we have to acknowledge that Black people, like actually similar to women, as I'll discuss next month, have been a part of cinema from the beginning. So let me just get my PowerPoint ready. And all right. So I'm back. I'm back on the Mac, so I have to figure out the presentation in Keynote. So before we get started on Black filmmakers, we do need to have the discussion of the stereotypical depictions of Black people in cinema. So we're probably, when we've talked about Black representation in cinema, this is something that's come up a lot. These stereotypes that really originated in the early 1900s, and in some cases, many cases actually predated cinema. We have the mammies, Hattie McDaniel's character in Gone with the Wind. And while many people will point to Hattie McDaniel's character as being fairly more fleshed out than many, she's still, she's still ultimately a mammy. And for that time, that was other kind of the only type of character a Black woman could play that had any dignity attached to it, if any at all. There was slow and childlike, like the character in Judge Priest. If you've seen Birth of a Nation or ever heard it discussed, Black people in that film are portrayed as animalistic, boorish, sexual predators, and that had a very real effect on how Black men were seen. And again, of course, this is kind of how they were already seen. But when you see something like that on screens across the country, that allows a stereotype to spread in ways that it can't otherwise. I would almost say it's similar to how a lie can spread on social media versus pre-social media. And even in films like To Kill a Mockingbird, you have the character of Tom, who is a good person. He didn't do anything wrong. He's wrongfully accused. He's still a fairly passive character. The main good character in this, in the film and in the story, is Atticus Finch. So we're going to continue. Other than Mammy, the main trope for Black women in early cinema was the Jezebel. So these are women who are overly sexualized. They're pretty much the female version of the animalistic sexual predator male character. And the character pictured is Lydia from Birth of a Nation. And she is actually, she's an interesting character to analyze because she is a mixed race character played by a white woman. So she is portrayed as both a traitor to both races, and she's also seen as someone who's very lascivious and lustful, and that is clearly because she is part Black. There's also the lazy Step and Fetch It. You've probably heard that term thrown around. Interesting note about Step and Fetch It, or the laziest man in the world. That was a character that was created by a Black vaudeville actor, and he did it more, again, just as a character, but it unfortunately took on a far darker life in the public sphere. And finally, we all know blackface, not done that much anymore, but that is also part of Black depictions in cinema, where Black people weren't even on screen. It was white people wearing Black makeup. And again, usually a very um, stereotypical depiction of that. So you would have a person in blackface and they would be portraying them as lazy and they'd be portraying them as boorish. And as I put here, these depictions were influenced by the time. They were also influenced by groups that had an interest in subjugating Black Americans. So the movie Birth of a Nation, the stories that were behind that were written by people who really idealized the Confederacy and idealized the original incarnation of the Klan. And as I said earlier, like this stuff does spread, and it had an influence in how Black people were seen in popular culture. So again, whenever people say it's just a movie, what is the big deal? Sometimes films have a real life effect. Actually, one moment. I should really just play the slideshow. Sorry, everybody, the fun of technical issues. But despite early Hollywood being full of pretty unsavory and by today's definition, outdated and frankly horrifying depictions, there was a Black Hollywood in the early 2010s. This took place outside of the regular Hollywood system, which, as we'll discuss a little bit later, had its downfalls as well. But these were Black creatives, writers, actors, in some cases directors, who were creating their own stories to tell not necessarily to a white audience, but to tell to their own audience. So films of Black Hollywood allowed Black people to see themselves not as mammies or Jezebels or lazy, but they were teachers, they were leaders, they were upstanding members of their community. Again, we still hear today when we talk about cinema, representation is important. Well, it goes all the way back to this. These were Black creatives who saw how they were being depicted and decided, I don't think this, this isn't right. So I'm going to do something else. So we're going to go to the first, I should say first known. There might have been someone else, so I'd like to always leave the possibility open. But the first known Black director in cinema history is Oscar Micheaux, and he had an honest to goodness remarkable life. I wish I could say that I'm shocked we haven't had an Oscar Micheaux biopic yet, but it also took us until 2019 to have a Harriet Tubman biopic. So yeah, again, not shocked. He was the son of former slaves, and he was someone who, as people would say, like hustled. He shined shoes. He was a farmer. He actually did homesteading on his own. He was a very smart person, and he had no formal film education. And, back in the day, there weren't really film schools as we know now. So people could, if they're like, I just want to make movies, could if they wanted to work in a production. So he formed his own production company in 1919, and over his life, he made 44 movies. He also wrote 7 novels, and his most famous film is Within Our Reach. Made a number of other movies, but Within Our Reach is famous. It's his most well-known, and it's famous because he made it directly as both as a result and a rebuttal to Birth of a Nation. So rather than having black characters portrayed as lascivious, as dumb, as conniving, and as predators, the main character is a mixed race woman who wants to open and operate a school. So rather than the Lydia of Birth of a Nation, we have a mixed race woman who is kind and idealistic. So something we'd be like, well, if we were to see this today, seems fairly common for a film. You have to remember, in the 1910s, that was a fairly revolutionary depiction of a woman of color. Unfortunately, a lot of his movies, along with a lot of the films of Black Hollywood, they're lost to time because they were made outside of the Hollywood studio system. There was also no real way to preserve them. These films, which were also called race films, they did find, in some cases, a second life on BET because private collectors had them. But in many cases, they've just been found or not found. They've just been lost to time, which is I think always a shame in film history. So these are films were popular from the 1910s to the 1950s. And the big production company was started by a man named Noble Johnson, who was also Black man. You can see him in the upper right-hand side. And he cast himself as an engineer in the film The Green-Eyed Monster. So again, rather than being someone lazy, or if this was directed by a white person, might be someone working the back of the train, he's an engineer, he's the hero, he gets to save the day. Unfortunately, the Lincoln Motion Picture Company only lasts until 2021, but the Lincoln Motion Picture Company was one of the first production companies to actually show Oscar Micheaux's films, and that gave him the big break to go forward. And similar to like the early films of Black Hollywood, you know, these race films showed Black people in far more dignified roles. And these were launch pads for a lot of fairly famous Black actors. Most notably, Lena Horne got her start in a race film. Unfortunately, though, if you look at who directed these movies, a lot of Black actors, still a majority of them were made by white men. But again, looking at it within the time, it was still better than some of the more mainstream films being offered. So we're going to move on to the 40s with a man named Spencer Williams, or sometimes goes by Spencer Williams Jr. So he only directed 10 films. He didn't have the prolific IMDb listing that Oscar Micheaux did, but that's because Spencer Williams actually got a start as an actor. So directing was something he got into a little bit later in his career. But like Oscar Micheaux, he was someone who he knew what he wanted to do. He set his mind to it, and he absolutely like worked his way to the top. He moved to New York City when he was a teenager. He worked in vaudeville shows, working as a stagehand, sometimes just being a door greeter. And he actually got mentored by vaudeville stars there. He took a break to both go to college and was in the Army in World War I. And then he came back to Hollywood, and he acted enough, and he actually started to he helped punch up scripts for certain other directors. And when he decided he wanted to direct one of the films he was working on, he said, "Oh, can I just see what you're doing and help you out?" And that kind of is how he started to build his skills. And his most famous work was The Blood of Jesus, which, from everything I have heard, it has not been a movie I've been able to track down. It is not a particularly great film, but if you look at it in terms of the budget it was produced on and the techniques that it tries, it is an incredibly ambitious film. And if you're wondering why this guy looks familiar, as I did note, he is most famous for playing Andy on the Amos and Andy show. At least when they went to television, they decided to, you know, cast Black people and not go a blackface route. But I think between Williams and Micheaux, we see such a drive to create, and also a multi-talented, I guess I should say multi-talentedness of people who they want to work in the industry, but they also know that potentially they might not be able to do it for long. And we're going to see this continued with a lot of other Black directors. So moving on more to Black cinema in the Civil Rights era. Unfortunately, with the 1950s and really more towards the end of World War II, race films really fell out of popularity. And some of this was actually, oddly enough, integration. So Ossie Davis, you may know him best as an actor, but he directed a few films as well. He said, "Integration dislocated many of the structures we had in our community by which we expressed ourselves economically, culturally, religiously, and otherwise." And it was also like, so a lot of this stuff kind of got swallowed up by the studios. And you'd think that that's good, that everything's being integrated, but the studio still figured what would sell best. And in Hollywood's mind, Black stories really didn't sell. So a lot of these creatives, a lot of these directors just gone. And also, again, we see that there was no real preservation put into a lot of these films. But there was also, especially in the early 60s with the rise of the civil rights movement, there was a drive to portray Black people with a bit more dignity. That aspect of the race film did survive. So we see the rise of people like Sidney Poitier. We also see the rise of Ossie Davis. And they tried it, there's plenty of films that came out that tackle race. So In the Heat of the Night is a very famous one. 1967 sees Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, Nothing But a Man. But unfortunately, again, these are all white directors. And this doesn't mean that these movies are bad by any means. I think all three of those films are great. I actually rewatched In the Heat of the Night a few years ago. I think it absolutely holds up. But it just gets down to who's telling these stories, and the unfortunate reality, as we see with a lot of stories in Hollywood, that the person who gets first dibs to tell them sometimes isn't the person that it's about. So we're going to look at some directors that came to rise during the civil rights era, like I would say 60s to early 70s. First is Sidney Poitier. Most people know him as an actor, obviously. Groundbreaking as the first Black man to win a Best Acting Oscar. Like Spencer Williams, he went to New York City as a teen, being like, I'm going to do this. Got his start in theater. A lot of the directors that I studied from this era got their start on the stage. And he decided he wanted to try his hand at directing. His first film was Buck and the Preacher. And if you've actually, his most famous work, if you've ever seen Stir Crazy, it's hysterical. I actually will, personal opinion, overall say I don't think Sidney Poitier is a particularly gifted director. Most of his films tend to be okay to not great, Stir Crazy aside. But he is someone who, by starting to direct and making films that made money, opened a lot of doors. And another thing that's notable is, unlike Spencer Williams and especially unlike Oscar Micheaux, his films almost, not intentionally, but definitely shied away from race, as opposed to some other directors that we'll discuss. Ossie Davis, again, you're probably most familiar with him as an actor. He was another person, got his start on the stage, and I could probably do an entire program on Ossie and Ruby Dee alone, because they lived an incredibly rich and interesting life of acting, of activism, and just of general creativity. And I think to almost put this man on one slide is a bit of a disservice. I mean, same to Sidney Poitier, really. But he's someone who got his start as a playwright, and he actually, his earliest films, while they dealt with race relations, they would technically be classified as blaxploitation features. In some cases, there's a little blur of the line as to what's what, but his debut, Cotton Comes to Harlem, definitely classifies as an exploitation feature. Whereas one of his more famous films, Black Girl, which goes into more the life of a Black woman, wouldn't really qualify as blaxploitation. But I would say, if you are not familiar with Ossie Davis, there is a website dedicated to he and his wife Ruby. He was also a playwright. They are both incredibly interesting and just, role models, really. So I would definitely look them up. So someone who might not be as well known, but lived, I think, incredibly interesting life, similar to everyone who preceded this, is Gordon Parks Sr. He's someone who grew up in Kansas. He attended a segregated elementary school, and unlike a lot of these other directors who got their starts on the stage, he was a photojournalist. And like Oscar Micheaux, he was self-taught, but he was multi-talented. So he was a photographer, he painted, he was a writer. I think he wrote over 15 books in his life. He was also the first Black photographer for Vogue. He co-founded the magazine Essence. And his first movie, The Learning Tree, was based on a book he had written, which was semi-autobiographical. Now, his most famous movie, you have absolutely heard of Shaft, one of the defining films of blaxploitation, one of the defining films of just, I would say, Black cinema. But if you look at Gordon Parks' career as a whole, Shaft almost seems a little out of place. If you look at his other work, he was a very intellectual, very thoughtful person. And he was, again, someone who, the thing I've noticed with a lot of these directors is they had a lot of different talents. They had a lot of different ways they expressed themselves. And a part of it was seemed to be they knew that if something didn't work out, or if they didn't get the opportunity in one arena, they may as well have another skill to fall back on. And someone who is still living today, Michael Schultz, he was someone who probably one of the first to get a formal, other than Ozzie Davis, who had an education at Howard, and Spencer Williams, who went to University of Minnesota. He's the first one to have a formal education specifically in film. So he actually went to school and watched foreign films. He watched the early French features. He actually saw stuff like Godard's Breathless and became inspired by that. And that made him want to become a filmmaker. And of course, like many others, he was a stage director first, worked in theater, and what we're going to actually see a lot coming up, worked a lot in television before going to the screen. And Michael Schultz is, I think, an unsung hero in terms of comedy directors. He did Cooley High, he did Car Wash, Kush Groove. He also directed the ill-fated Village People film, Can't Stop the Music. I mean, you can't hold that against him. Everyone's Get Up Mulligan. And if you are a fan of martial arts films, he directed The Last Dragon, which is a phenomenally silly martial arts movie. In terms of, I would say, like cult cinema, he, despite making it like a, I would say at the very least, The Last Dragon, Cooley High, and maybe Can't Stop the Music for camp quality, I see them come up a lot in cult circles in terms of favorite films, but he doesn't get the credit that, say, a David Lynch or a John Waters does. So I would like to start the Michael Schultz Appreciation Society. So we're going forward to someone who didn't have a lot of films on his resume for, I guess I should say, political reasons. But the few that he made are still talked about and still fairly beloved, especially his contribution to the horror community. So Bill Gunn, born and raised in Philadelphia, got his start writing. So he was a playwright. He wrote novels, and he also got a start in acting. So he kind of went more the Ozzie Davis and Sidney Poitier path, or the Spencer Williams path, really. His first feature, Stop, was actually never shown. I still don't believe it's ever had a formal release. And the other big famous work that he made was Ganja and Hess, which is a black vampire film. Yeah, it didn't start with Blade, everybody. But unlike Blade, which is an action film, or a predecessor, Blackula, which is a bit more campy, Ganja and Hess is a very serious vampire film. If I had to think of a comparison, I would probably pick Jim Jarmusch's Only Lovers Left Alive. It is a very blunt work. It is very graphic. It is violent, and it was not well received. Although, interesting fact, if you are a horror fan, it is the other big lead role for Dwayne Jones, who was in Night of the Living Dead. And he wrote, you can find this in the I think you might be able to search our databases. If not, it is just out there online. He wrote a letter about, called To Be a Black Artist, and he wrote it in the New York Times, and he pretty much took to task racism in film criticism. And what he said was, via film criticism, you are telling Black people how to act and how to express themselves, because he said, ultimately, you're viewing our films through a white gaze, and we have another way of expressing ourselves. And as he also got down to it, we have different stories we want to tell that might not be comfortable to white audiences. And we'll actually get into another film, The Spook Who Sits by the Door, that rattled a lot of people as well. But he was someone who ultimately found the system to be suffocating. He still continued to work, but directing was something he just found to be not an endeavor that really fulfilled him, which is unfortunate, because if you are a horror fan, Ganja and Hess is fantastic. And speaking of Black horror, William Crane, graduate of UCLA, he didn't make a lot of movies, but his most famous film, Blackula, is what many people consider to be the true birth of Black horror. And there's actually a great documentary that's out right now. It's called Horror Noir, and it's directed by a man kind of tracing Blackness in the horror genre. And this was the first time in many cases, a Black man took the reins of horror. If you'd seen horror in a lot of previous films, they were either not a part of it, or if you'd watched films like the 30s and 40s, they were in some cases the zombies, or they were scared, or they were victims. If anything, actually, George Romero's Night of the Living Dead was an incredible game changer because it featured Dwayne Jones as the hero. And Blackula is, again, seen as a camp classic, but I've listened to William Crane talk about it. And for him, he went in because he wanted to explore the Dracula legend. He didn't necessarily see it as campy. He did want there to be comedy in it, but he's still polite about this, but he said the studio wanted one thing, I wanted another, and there was clashes over that. And he eventually went back to directing in television, where he felt he had a little bit more freedom. Honestly, I have to say, I love that he is still just willing to go and interview for practically any podcast or blog out there that wants to talk about horror. That for me is the sign of a director who does like what he does, just willing to say, sure, I'll talk to you about this. But again, for all of its camp value aside, in the larger realm of Black horror, Blackula is the starting point. So quick note, I mentioned that Crane went to UCLA. There is a film movement that got its start in the late 60s called the LA Rebellion. And this refers to young Black filmmakers who studied at UCLA, and they went on to make films, and a lot of them were radical. They were personal, they were political, they didn't really want to deal with commercial subjects. So they wanted to make something more along the lines of what Bill Gunn was doing, or Ossie Davis's Black Girl, then Sidney Poitier doing Stir Crazy. So this coincides with the new Hollywood cinema, or the new Hollywood movement as a whole. So for a quick background about New Hollywood movement, in the late 60s, the studio system really kind of collapsed. A number of just features that did poorly really bankrupted a lot of studios. And in the rubble, there were a lot of young, hungry filmmakers who had been raised on movies, who were like, you know what, I want to tell different stories. I want to tell stories my way. So this is where we get films like Bonnie and Clyde. This is where Coppola comes. This is where Martin Scorsese comes out. And, where the auteur era comes in again. And it's it is interesting looking at, say, the reaction to Bill Gunn's Ganja and Hess in the, looking at it alongside films like Taxi Driver or Mean Streets coming out. You have people like Paul Schrader and Martin Scorsese making films that are incredibly violent, incredibly holding a mirror up to society and not showing you exactly nice things, whereas Black creatives are doing something similar and not getting the acclaim or awards attention that Scorsese would get. And I did say, if you'd like to read more about the LA Rebellion, there is a book that came out about it in 2015. So moving on, at some point we had to get here to Blaxploitation. When a lot of people think about Black cinema, and this is where my mind went to when I talked about this in film school back in college, I kind of thought it pretty much began with Blaxploitation. Again, as we've seen before, not exactly, but Blaxploitation was a way for a lot of Black creatives to get their start and get noticed. So you could actually draw a comparison to the race films of earlier. These were usually low budget. They usually always made a profit, and they had a built-in audience. The race films were played for Black people going to segregated cinemas. The Blaxploitation films usually played to more of an urban crowd. But again, built-in audience, they didn't cost a lot of money. They were made quickly. and they had um, a definitive impact on society going forward. You still see blaxploitation's influence in cinema. What be it a tribute film like Black Dynamite or Quentin Tarantino, who also grew up watching blaxploitation, wanted to make a blaxploitation film in Django Unchained. Whether or not he succeeded or even should have done that, there are other people who are not my pigmentation who have discussed it, and I think they're better qualified. But as much as blaxploitation is kind of lauded and loved as a genre now, back in the day, it was not universally beloved. In many cases, blaxploitation was thrown as a pejorative, as a like, in kind of this idea of you're making us look bad. This is bad for the culture. This is giving white audiences exactly what they want in terms of how they see us. Um, but it was also, again, for many Black creatives, they're like, this is where I'm getting work. I'd like to move beyond this in some cases. And it launched a ton of careers. Jim Brown, if anyone actually recently saw the Regina King film One Night in Miami, Jim Brown got his start in Westerns, but he became like, he had his work cut out for him in blaxploitation films. Fred Williamson, Richard Roundtree with Shaft, and obviously Pam Grier, who is still working today. But unfortunately, like race films, if you look at who directed these movies, a lot of them were white people. And again, I would argue these directors, if especially if you look at behind the scenes, they kind of let the actors do their thing. They kind of knew, I'm going to step back. I'm not going to try to enforce my views on stuff. I'm going to let the actors, and in some cases there were Black writers, kind of guide the way. But still, it's the representation thing. It's ultimately who is telling our story. And I should say Larry Cohen, a filmmaker that I love, has made blaxploitation. I'm like, oh well, it's fine. I'm okay. I'm ultimately okay with it. Ultimately, blaxploitation, in retrospect, is looked back on now as not like oh, this is terrible for the culture, but kind of a dawn of new cinema. It's the idea of something special is happening here, and something new can come out of this. So can't talk about blaxploitation without talking about Melvin Van Peebles, who is still with us, by the way, and is just the definition of a cool old dude. He got to start making short movies in the 50s. He was also an author, wrote his first book in 1957. And his debut film, which was Story of the 3-Day Pass, is based on a short story he wrote. And you've probably heard of this movie, Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song. A defining film of the blaxploitation genre, still referenced today. And actually, he has a son named Mario, who is also an actor and a filmmaker. And he's still kicking it. He actually had a great quote that I wanted to share where he said, I'm not going to let the accolades come to me when I'm in a wheelchair. They say, get a little more feeble, Melvin, and then we'll recognize you. Right now, I'm a little too dangerous. I intend to stay dangerous. So we're moving on to Gordon Parks Jr. So we covered his father, Gordon Parks Sr. This is a sad case because Gordon Parks Jr. wanted to follow in his father's footsteps, and he was incredibly prolific. He directed 4 movies within 6 years. It was Superfly 3 The Hard Way, which featured both Fred Williamson and Jim Brown, Thomasine and Bushrod, and Aaron Loves Angela. Unfortunately, he was killed in 1979. He had gone to Kenya to film a movie, and there was a plane crash, and that cut both his life and a very promising career short. And it is interesting to think, like, how would he have evolved along with the rest of cinema? Because if you look at his 2 later films, Aaron Loves Angela is more of a romantic style film versus, the blaxploitation of Superfly. So we were already starting to see an artist ready to evolve and ready to try out new genres. And again, anytime an artist goes too soon, you wonder, what else could we have had? So next, director D'Urville Martin. He only directed 1 blaxploitation film, but it is again, one of those just, it is a defining film for the genre, and that is Dolomite. So you might have heard the name Dolomite a few years ago with the Eddie Murphy Netflix film Dolomite Is My Name, which is about the creation of this movie. I believe Wesley Snipes played Martin. He actually got to start acting in the film Black Like Me, which, if you are not familiar with Black Like Me, that is about, it was a famous book. A white person dyed their skin black and went to school to see what it was like living as a black man. Nowadays, that sounds a little bit like Robert Downey Jr.'s stint in Tropic Thunder, but at the time, it was very well received as an expose. Again, context is important for time. But unfortunately, yes, Dolomite was the only film he directed. He also starred in it, but sometimes you can only make one film and have an incredible impact. So we're moving on to Ivan Dixon. So I talked earlier about Bill Gunn being an incredibly political filmmaker, and for that reason, directing was not something he had a lot of opportunities in. And Ivan Dixon is similar. So got to start on the stage, and he was a TV actor for the most part. He was in Hogan's Heroes. He was on The Twilight Zone. He was in the episode Big Tall Wish, and I believe he's the lead in I Am the Night, Color Me Black. And he started to direct television episodes. He made his debut with Trouble Man, which is a blaxploitation film, but in 1973, he adapted a book called The Spook Who Sat by the Door, which is about a man named Dan Freeman. He's enlisted by the CIA to perform espionage, and Freeman kind of becomes the token black person of the CIA. What he does is he masters the agency tactics, and after he becomes disillusioned with everything, he drops out of the CIA. He trains young Chicago black people to become freedom fighters. And it is a book that's about someone who is very angry with what he sees as white ruling class hypocrisy. Definitely, as you can imagine, in 1973, ruffled a few feathers. It went into theaters, left very quickly. There's allegations that the FBI suppressed it. I actually believe the New York Times went and looked over, and they confirmed that there was some suppression. But this film has been redeemed by time. In 2012, it was added to the National Film Registry, and it's considered an uncompromising look at a vision of Black armed resistance. And it is a film that comes from a very angry place, but it's not anger motivated by hate. It's anger motivated by this sense of injustice. It is a very interesting film if you ever see it. And that was the last film that Dixon directed. But I think, as we're seeing, you do not have to direct a lot of films to leave a mark on cinema history. So we're moving on to the 80s and 90s. So this is where we're starting to really see an explosion of Black creativity and kind of the after effects with blaxploitation and its popularity, because blaxploitation was also popular with white audiences. So studios are starting to realize, oh wait, maybe it's worth investing in these filmmakers. We also had a lot of students out of the LA Rebellion coming out of UCLA, and people who had gone to film school, again, other creatives who grew up on film and kind of had more of an idea of, I want to work in cinema. So we also had a lot of political features, but it wasn't just serious drama political features that dealt with a wealth of issues. So you had Hollywood Shuffle, which is about race representation in Hollywood, and it's a comedy, so it's poking fun at this stuff. Spike Lee's first movie is more of a comedy about sex and relationships, and that's She's Gotta Have It. You have Daughters of the Dust, which is about Black womanhood. That's Julie Dash's film about women in the Gullah community. And the 80s and 90s, especially the 90s, was seen as a real golden age for Black creativity, because not only that, in the 80s and into the 90s, rap music was really hitting its popular peak. You had sitcoms on television. You had Martin, you had Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, you had Living Single. It really seemed to be that Black people were finding a space in the larger creative mainstream. But so with everything we see now, I have this quote from a Guardian article, quote, "It's easy to forget just what a struggle they had. Townsend had to max out credit cards and scavenge leftover film stock to cobble together Hollywood Shuffle. It took Lee 4 years to raise $175,000 to make She's Gotta Have It in a brisk 12 days. Lee even encouraged his crew to save their drink cans so he could cash them in for recycling." So again, with all this success, we can forget the fact that, like a lot of Black creatives before, they absolutely worked their way to get into this space. And in some cases, a lot of these people, like Carl Franklin, Robert Townsend, and Julie Dash, especially, they have these hit and well received first features, and then they find it incredibly hard to make another feature. In some cases, it's because this came up right around the general independent cinema boom, and that kind of swallowed everything up. Julie Dash has a quote about that in the same Guardian article that I recognize. She says, quote, "A big problem," says Julie Dash, "was that Black cinema's ascent coincided with Hollywood's takeover of the independent cinema industry as a whole. Quote, it became a commodity that could be co-opted by the larger industry. We broke through, and once the curators of culture recognized that we were actively making films in our own way, suddenly it just slowed down to a halt. Funding ran out for pretty much everyone." So, and again, if you look at a lot of these creatives, they'll have first features, they'll have second, and then after a while it runs dry. If anything, pretty much like Spike Lee and John Singleton were the only people who had hits in the 80s and 90s who really maintained a career until the end. In some cases, it's sad because, again, you wonder what more could they have done? And we'll get to that, especially with Julie Dash. So first, we're going to talk about probably the best filmmaker you haven't heard of, Charles Burnett. So big member of the UCLA film movement. He's both documentary and fiction. His most famous movie is Killer of Sheep, and Killer of Sheep was filmed over 5 years, mainly because one of the actors was imprisoned, so they had to work around that. And that is about a man who works in a slaughterhouse and just the effect that it takes on his family. You could call it neo-realism in LA's Watts district. There's also a problem with Killer of Sheep's distribution for a while because some of the music it used didn't have rights clearance. So that was another one, like, for a while, incredibly hard to find. I believe it's finally had a proper release. He's also directed My Brother's Wedding, To Sleep with Anger, The Glass Shield, and Selma Lord Selma. And he is still active today. So now we're getting to probably the most famous director we all know is Spike Lee. Ultimately the big success story of the Black indie boom of the 80s. And I do love this picture of him with Samuel Jackson getting that Oscar. The 2018 Oscars are kind of a mess, but I did love that moment where Samuel Jackson's up on stage. He calls out Spike's name as the winner. And it's just a nice moment of a friend being very happy for another friend. Similarly, when Jordan Peele won the Oscar for Get Out, there's a photo of Keegan Michael Key, who's his collaborator for Key and Peele, just cheering. And I'm like, oh, that just makes me happy. I mean, obviously, pretty much everyone has seen at least one or two Spike Lee films. He's been consistently directing since the 80s. So he went to Morehouse, which is a historically Black university, and then NYU. So his debut was She's Gotta Have It. And it's not only credited with ushering in Black indie cinema, but it's now considered a part of regular American indie cinema. And as we saw before, he wrote that for only, not wrote, starred and directed, edited for under $200,000 back in the 80s. Like that is a feat. I don't even think I could do that today. And he's made over 35 features, both fiction and nonfiction narratives. I would say for a nonfiction film, if you've never seen his films about Hurricane Katrina, I would absolutely recommend. And though he's made 35 features, including last year's The Five Bloods and 2018's Black Klansman, both fantastic films, if I do say, his most famous film is still Do the Right Thing, which takes place over one day, and it's a discussion of race relations in New York. It's famous. I remember when Barack Obama was running in 2008, and a little bit of a big deal was made about the fact that he and Michelle's first date movie was Do the Right Thing. People took a lot out of that, but they forget that everyone was seeing Do the Right Thing at that time. So the other big success story of the late 80s, early 90s was John Singleton, Boys in the Hood, which actually warranted him. He was the first Black American ever to be nominated for Best Director. And I do love his story growing up, where he's just like, I was a nerd, but he also says that kept him out of trouble. He was born and raised in California. He's from LA. And all of his films deal with LA. Unfortunately, he passed away, I think, far too early in 2019. Then again, if you've never seen Boys in the Hood, recommend it. It was also, I believe, Cuba Gooding Jr.'s big debut. So, F. Gary Gray, I keep wanting to call him F. Gary Gary. I hope I'm not the only one who's done that. He was not a last minute addition, but someone I added after reading his story as to how he became a director. So he was someone else, came out of LA, but he did not go to UCLA. He did not go to film school, but he knew at a young age he wanted to make films. He wanted to be in the industry. He went to a local TV studio and said, inquired if they had jobs. He got a job as a camera operator, and he got to start in music videos, which is where, especially for the 90s and early aughts, a lot of directors got their start, and worked his way up to directing his first feature, which was Friday. And Friday is a movie is still, I would consider, of the past 30 years, one of the most influential comedies, and it's still referenced today. I mean, how many times do you hear "Bye, Felicia"? But there is a quote from him that I really liked. He said, quote, "I didn't grow up studying Orson Welles. All of the greats, I learned about them after the fact." And I like that idea because it speaks to the democratization of filmmaking. For a while, there was this idea of you had to go to film school. You had to get all of this formalized training and formalized education in order to make films. But if we look at the first filmmakers, they didn't have that. And this idea that, yes, you can get your start at a local TV studio, and as you're learning how to make films, you can learn independently about cinema greats and incorporate that into your work, I think is a very inspiring work. And I like how it basically expresses, yes, anyone can do this. You don't have to be formally trained. So moving on to Julie Dash, who we heard from earlier. She was someone who went to CCNY for undergrad. She's from New York. She grew up in the Bronx, and she actually said that she didn't imagine herself being a filmmaker when she was younger. I recently got her book about Daughters of the Dust and how she made it. She actually said something which touched my heart. She said, "I think if I didn't make films, I'd be a librarian," because she loves just sitting around and reading and researching. So thank you, Julie. I'm flattered. She started out with short films, and she made her debut film, Daughters of the Dust, which was for a while her only film. And this was a movie that got a lot of critical acclaim, but she could not get funding for a follow-up feature. And in the same Guardian article that I referenced, Richard Brody of The New Yorker is quoted talking about, like, comparing her to Richard Linklater, who had kind of hit fame around a similar time. Richard Linklater of Slacker, Dazed and Confused, Boyhood. And Richard Brody said that he is a good filmmaker in his own right, but the fact that he got a second feature almost right away, he's been able to make 15 films, while Julie Dash could not even secure a second feature. He's like, this does speak to an inequality in the system in terms of who Hollywood thinks is a safer bet for money, and who Hollywood thinks, in terms of who wants to see these stories. People might look at something like Daughters of the Dust as unrelatable, but I could say that potentially Dazed and Confused is not something I can 100% relate to, but I can find aspects of it that I do. And I think for something like Daughters of the Dust, that absolutely applies. No one can 100% relate to any movie, But I think the power of cinema is no matter who is telling the story or whose story is being told, we can find something that we relate to. Thankfully, she has stayed active. She teaches film occasionally. She still directs for television. She does mentor new directors. And it is someone where, especially now that there is a lot more doors open for um, Black creatives, especially Black female creatives, she's actually getting a career renaissance. If you are familiar with the Beyonce video for Lemonade, Daughters of the Dust is heavily visually referenced in the second half of that visual album. So moving on to another, she's only made one feature, but she's still someone who is incredibly important to film, and that is Cheryl Dunn. So she is not only part of the Black indie movement, she's part of queer new wave of the 90s. So she wrote and directed and starred in this movie called The Watermelon Woman. So The Watermelon Woman is about a young lesbian who is a film student trying to make a documentary about this racial caricature, or this character that she saw in film that is based on a character called the Watermelon Woman. I believe it was streaming on Amazon Prime for a while, so if you have it, maybe check. But it's a film that not only deals with relationships and with sexuality, but the representation of Black women in cinema history, and how some of the stereotypes might still hold true today. Cassie Lemons, who recently had a fairly famous feature, which was the biopic of Harriet. You might recognize her. She's been in a lot of movies. Silence of the Lambs, one of my favorite films. She's Ardelia. Or if you are a fan of Jean-Claude Van Damme, she was in Hard Target. I would not put that as same caliber of Silence of the Lambs, but still incredibly fun film. So she began her career as an actress, and she made her debut, Eve's Bayou, in the mid-90s. And she's actually recently adapted Charles Blow's book, Fire Shut Up in My Bones, as an opera. And she's been making films on and off since the 90s. She had Black Nativity, she did Caveman's Valentine. But Harriet, especially because it received Oscar nominations, really opened up a lot of doors for her. But again, it's this idea of like, it took this long for her to really be recognized as a creative. And rounding out the 90s, I do think we need to talk about the Wayans family. They are not what you would consider high art, but if you want to look at comedy and the influence of comedy, you cannot not talk about the Wayans brothers, Keenan, Damon, Sean, and Marlon. So Keenan, on the far left, he is the one who created In Living Color, which sketch comedy show from the early 90s, incredibly influential. It's known for launching Jim Carrey. The Wayans saw that Jim Carrey had a talent when I think Saturday Night Live just looked at him and said, "We don't get it." So there's one thing, they have an eye for talent. He also directed Scary Movie. Sean and Marlon wrote this film called Don't Be a Menace While Drinking Juice in Your Hood, which is a parody of hood films and Scary Movie. And they helped usher Black comedy into the mainstream. So you can really argue, if not for Living Color being popular in the early 90s, the film Friday might not have caught on the way it did. And you can have your arguments about, is Scary Movie a good movie or not? I have my own feelings about what that franchise really did in terms of parody, but it at the very least had an influence, and you have to give them that. So we're going to move on to, I would say, the new class, so the aughts and beyond. And speaking of creatives who've had an impact, but a lot of debate over whether it's good or not, we have to talk about Tyler Perry. Tyler Perry is someone who his films have received both acclaim and criticism. Some of the criticism is that they're too moralistic. They put the moral substance over good directing. There's definitely critiques of the depiction of women. Again, there have been a lot of Black academics and reviewers who've written about this who would be better people to consult. But if there is one thing I will give Tyler Perry, it is that he is someone who, like a lot of the creatives we've seen before, absolutely worked their way and worked hard to get this place at the table. He was someone, he didn't even just not have a formal film education, he didn't have a formal education at all. He got his GED, he went to Atlanta. From everything he said about his upbringing, it was not stable and not good. But he found a place for himself in community theater, and he started doing the Medea character on stage. It started off as a one-time character, but it became a massive fan favorite, and he became very popular around the church circuit, which down in the South is a very big money-making circuit. Like, there are entire plays made just for church audiences. And he was someone who was smart enough at the early aughts to sell DVDs of his stage performances to make money. And that stuff eventually funded Diary of a Mad Black Woman. So again, love his films or not, the man at least has a mind for business. And in terms of what we're going to see in the future and what we're really seeing now, the fact that his films were a success, they proved to the Hollywood industry that yes, Black audiences are someone you should not only bank on, but maybe, yes, cater to. And we see this a lot with these films when, like, a movie starring women like Bridesmaids comes out and studios are like, oh, maybe that's a fluke, we didn't expect this. And it's like, well, women are 50% of the population. Are you shocked we want to see movies? The same goes for films starring Black people. It's like, there's a lot of Black people in the United States. Maybe they do want to see something that is about their lives and about them. So, after years and years of writing off the successes of stuff like Boys in the Hood, Do the Right Thing, Friday as flukes, they finally saw hit after hit after hit with Tyler Perry, where they're like, no, this is an audience that we should absolutely make films for. So coming off of that, we have Ava DuVernay, who is another, probably I would say, big name right now. You've probably seen Selma. Her documentary, The 13th, was nominated for an Oscar that actually featured Angela Davis. She went to UCLA, so she's of the UCLA. I don't think she doesn't meet the rebellion stage, but she's of that filmmaker class. She actually got her start in journalism and covered the OJ trial at one point, and she kind of put it as that led to her disillusionment with journalism. And she went on to make films. Her Roger Ebert was a big advocate for her first feature, I Will Follow, and that really kind of helped her get traction to make her second film, Middle of Nowhere, and then Selma. And with The Wrinkle in Time, she was the first Black woman to direct a film that cost $100 million. And of course, again, think how many men, particularly white men, have gotten to direct films that not only cost $100 million, but $300 million. Actually, I should say before I go on, if she has worked in television as well. If you've not seen her miniseries about the Central Park Five, When They See Us, that is on Netflix, and I would 100% recommend it. So we're going on to my absolute, the person I've been the most excited to discuss of the new class, and that is Jordan Peele. Jordan Peele, a guy who would have thought a guy who got started in comedy would be so good at scaring you. He, along with other creatives like I would, probably Jennifer Kent, Annie Biller, Robert Eggers, Ari Aster, they're ushering this new era of art horror, where horror kind of goes through these segments of being exploitation films and stuff that no one ever would, not considered good. And then every 15, 20 years, there's some very well-directed horror films that come out. We're kind of in the middle of a horror renaissance right now. He really broke down the door with Get Out. I mean, that is such a great story for a debut. Also, a great advertising campaign, because that is one that did not give away the real twist of that film. And with the Broken Records, it brought a renewed interest in the genre of Black horror. And he is the first Black, not just Black man, the first Black person to win the Best Original Screenplay Oscar in 2017. His most famous movie is Get Out. He's also helmed the Twilight Zone reboot, and I would say his follow-up feature, Us, is also fantastic. Lupita Nyong'o was robbed of an Oscar last year. I'll leave it at that. So Dee Reese, probably someone else, if you follow the Oscars, you've heard her name. She directed Mudbound and was nominated for Best Adapted Screenplay. She made her debut in 2011 with Pariah, which was about a young woman dealing with her sexuality. So she's kind of like a Cheryl Dunn, sort of not only going with Black cinema, but specifically queer Black cinema. And Spike Lee was a mentor for her. She actually worked behind the scenes on Inside Man doing production work. She recently had a film, All She Ever Wanted, come out on Netflix. I would say if you have not seen Mudbound is on Netflix, and if you've not seen Pariah, I would recommend it. It is a fantastic film. And again, we're looking at these women now getting second features almost right away, whereas you have to wonder if they were to come into their own in the 90s or 80s, would it have stopped at their first? Moving on to, man, if you ever want to feel like you're not doing enough with your life, Ryan Coogler, who is my age. He's already directed 3 movies, all good too. He directed Fruitvale Station, he directed Creed, and then he directs Black Panther. He comes from a family where activism is valued and social consciousness is valued. His mother is a community organizer. His father was a counselor for troubled youth. He actually initially went to school on a football scholarship. Film wasn't super in his mind, but when the football program got cut, he got into cinema and decided, okay, I guess this is where I'm going. His debut, which is Fruitvale Station, is a film that's kind of unfortunately remained timely since its debut, as it deals with the murder of Oscar Grant and the issue of police brutality. He's also worked with Michael B. Jordan for all 3 of his features. So this name probably isn't as familiar, but you've definitely seen her work. Gina Price Blythewood. She, and again, another you're starting to see UCLA just come back more and more. So she started off as a writer on A Different World, which, if you're not familiar, was the spinoff of A Cosby Show, which was initially intended for Lisa Bonet. She left after the first season. Different World doesn't feature Bill Cosby, so it's probably a little bit more watchable today. Her debut, Love and Basketball, was produced by Spike Lee. And her latest film, The Old Guard, was released on Netflix, and it was heralded as, a good old-fashioned summer blockbuster style movie. And as she says about being a Black filmmaker, she says, quote, "It is one of my goals in life to obliterate the term Black film. For me, it is just about people of color in every genre and making it become normal." So she's done that with Love and Basketball, which is a sports film, Beyond the Lights, which is kind of a music showbiz movie, and The Old Guard, which is an action film and an adaptation of a graphic novel. And finally, Barry Jenkins. He went to Florida State University. Like a lot of people in this, got to start as a production assistant. It's actually really nice to see this, because when I'm looking at a lot of not that I don't think Sofia Coppola is a talented person, but you look at some of these stories of people who were pretty much grandfathered into the industry. You especially see this in the acting world. It is nice to see stories of these creatives who really worked their way up to the top. His first feature came out in 2008 and it was Medicine for Melancholy, and then Moonlight, which came out in 2016. The first film with an all-Black cast and the first film dealing with queer people and queer issues to win Best Picture. Like, we all remember thinking Brokeback Mountain was going to win it, and then Crash wins. Ew. His follow-up feature was based If Beale Street Could Talk, which is based on James Baldwin's book. But Moonlight, at the time, as of right now, is still his most famous feature. I think the great thing about looking at a lot of these creatives is, unlike some, when you look at the directors from older eras, you hear stories about how they kind of not petered out, but hit a wall dealing with studios or dealing with, battling with producers. Here, they are far more calling the shots. They are in control of where their career is going to go. So you look at all these creatives and you're like, there's no telling what else they can do, and the future looks brighter for them. So obviously, here are some other directors and creatives. Scott Sanders, who directed a great blaxploitation tribute called Black Dynamite. Nia DaCosta, A Little Woods, which came out 2019. I loved that film, and she's going to direct the Candyman remake. Justin Simeon's Dear White People. Boots Riley, Sorry to Bother You. Charlie Russell, Five on the Black Hand Side. Regina King, she just directed her first feature, One Night in Miami. And Rada Blank, The 40-Year-Old Version, which is on Netflix. One of the things I have seen going through this is I'm starting to see the gender imbalance disappear, and we're starting to see a lot more women telling their stories as well. And again, this will win you a bar bet. Forrest Whitaker directed Waiting to Exhale. I kid you not. So I just want to take a little detour to international cinema and documentaries. Most of my program has been focused on American cinema. That's what I know the most of, but there's still a lot of international creatives I want to highlight. Matty Diop, Atlantics is a great film. Raoul Peck, he's Haitian. He directed the James Baldwin documentary, I'm Not Your Negro. Yuzan Palsy, she directed A Dry White Season. Laj Lee, Les Miserables, which was France's selection for Best Foreign Feature last year at the Oscars. So there's three big names we should go over. The first is Steve McQueen. I do wonder if anyone was wondering, where's the guy who directed 12 Years a Slave? Well, Steve McQueen is British. And also, as you can tell looking at that picture, it's not that Steve McQueen. He is worked with Michael Fassbender in all three of his, oh wait, nope, never mind, Widows, scratch that. So 3 of his first films worked with Michael Fassbender. His debut was 2008's Hunger, which was about the IRA, an IRA prisoner's hunger strike. And he directed 12 Years a Slave, which is an incredibly unflinching slave narrative, and one of the few that cinema really has. In a lot of cases, slavery is addressed in American cinema either kind of glossed over the way we see it in Gone with the Wind, or we have it in kind of the exploitation mandingo type of genre. I mean, other than, we have Roots, but it's something that American cinema has really failed to address head on. And I don't think that's something that lies squarely at the feet of Hollywood. I think it is a larger cultural problem that we still have. He did have a follow-up, which is Widows, which written by Gillian Flynn. If you're in for a heist picture, I think that is an underrated film and a great performance by Viola Davis. So going back in time a little bit, Djibril Diop Mbeti. So he's a Senegalese filmmaker. He's only had 2 big features, Tuki Buki and Hyenas. So Tuki Buki is a very freewheeling, almost anarchic kind of Bonnie and Clyde tale. There's a freedom to it. And he made Hyenas about 20 years later, and that is a far more pessimistic film about the state of politics in his country. Very famous for nonlinear narratives, as we see in Tuki Buki, and Tuki Buki is actually getting a Criterion release, so if you are interested in seeing it, there will be a remaster coming out. And considered the father of African cinema, Ousmane Sembène, also from Senegal, but he was born back when it was called French West Africa. He made a film that dealt with not only race, but the effect of colonialism on race. So his film Black Girl deals with a young Black woman who is a nanny for a French family, and kind of these small microaggressions and little small humiliations that she faces, and the just everyday things that make her feel dehumanized. It's a heartbreaking film. And again, it's a Criterion, the Criterion Collection has made a very concerted effort to try to widen the canon in terms of what is considered cinema. Again, for a while it was, you had American creatives, you had Italian, German, and French, and then you had Kurosawa in Japan. and they have been making an effort to be like, we need to have creatives from other countries. They made an effort to get films from like a Czech New Wave. And they've made an effort very recently to include African filmmakers, and they've released Black Girl. Again, if you'd like to find it, it is available. It is likely available on the Criterion channel. It's just a way to finish up. Documentary filmmakers, if you are interested in the Black queer experience, Marlon Riggs has made a lot of films about being Black and gay. William Greaves he's an interesting case. So he worked on over 200 films, but his most famous is Symbiopsychotoxoplasm, which I've actually seen. It is a very freewheeling, it's supposed to be behind the scenes of making a film, but it's really more of a meta documentary. Roger Ross Williams, who was the first African American director to win an Oscar for music by Prudence, and he was nominated for Life Animated. Shola Lynch, and as I mentioned earlier, Horror Noir, which is directed by Xavier Bergen. So just, I know this has been a long program, but a couple of books if you're interested in further reading. Donald Bogle is someone who is really good to read, especially if you're looking at the depiction of Black people on film. So the film, the book Toms, Coons, Mulattoes, Mammies, and Bucks is a very informative book on that. We read a little bit of that when I was in college. There is if you want just a good guide for Blaxploitation films, the Coven book is that. Separate Cinema is a book I want to track down because I read about it and it sounds fascinating. This is a Black poster art from the first 100 years of cinema. And if you're familiar with with Bell Hooks, she talks about race, sex, and class in cinema. So a lot of films like Killer Sheep, Spike Lee, Julie Dash, she goes into that in that book as well. Also, if you're interested in, if you just want something online, there is an online exhibit at the Duke University Libraries, and it's called From Blackface to Blaxploitation, Representations of African Americans in Film. So I will stop sharing. And does anyone have any questions? Oh, none at all?
No questions, just a comment. That was a lot to do.
Take in. It's a lot.
A lot to take in, an hour and 15 minutes.
It really is. I kind of was like, I really should have maybe split this up, but.
How long did it take you to put that together, actually? I mean.
A lot of times. If you saw me at the reference desk working on something, it was very likely that.
Okay, yeah. No,
but what I liked about this was I think we have this idea of like what black cinema is, and when Black creatives became or gained control of their creative stories, and finding out that it began a lot earlier and then it was lost for a large amount of the century was a really interesting thing for me to find out.
One of the movies you brought up, In the Heat of the Night, I mean, every time I watch that, it seems, I don't know what the right word is, but you can just see almost the hatred that each have for one another. I mean, there's white actors in the movie. I mean, it's just that acting, obviously, but it's almost like, wow. I mean, it really looks like they, and even you can see Sidney Poitier's like, he knows he's better than most of these people, smarter, more intelligent than most of these people, but it's you see the seething, just the way some of these people, it's.
Well, and that's why, I mean, you see a film like The Spook Who Sat by the Door, and I mean, you just read the synopsis and you can understand why that, especially in the wake of civil rights and with the rise of the Black Panther Party, and of course, what the FBI did to people like Fred Hampton, you can see why that terrified a lot of people. But when you watch films like Birth of a Nation, or even films like In the Heat of the Night, you can almost you can absolutely see where this anger comes from.
Oh no, absolutely. Yeah, no question. I mean, no question about it. Yeah.
I mean, I don't think it kind of, it had its moment, but I don't think it gets discussed enough. I think Spike Lee's Black Klansman is an incredibly pessimistic work. I think when it came out, there was the story there that seemed funny of a black man infiltrating the KKK. But you watch this movie, it's ultimately this idea of a man really starting to realize that the system that he works within really can't stop this. And if you've seen the end of Black Klansman, ultimately the end is it got worse. People like David Duke did get their message into the mainstream. And it doesn't have the incendiary nature of The Spook That Sits by the Door, but that is a film where I feel, especially at the end of it, a real anger coming off of Spike. An anger that I don't think I'd seen in his work since stuff like Do the Right Thing. Well, actually, no, let me I do think if you watch his films about Katrina, he's absolutely angry there as well. But those are fictional. That's a documentary narrative, and I'm speaking strictly about his fictional narratives. The film I hope everyone just goes out and watches is Julie Dash's Daughter of the Dust. That is a beautiful film. And it has found a second life because a lot of Black women who went to film school or just got into filmmaking watched it, and that influenced them. So of course, whenever they're being interviewed and they're asked, what are your influences? That comes up. And again, it got a very famous boost from Beyonce in 2016 in Lemonade, where she drew heavily upon the imagery and talked about it. That kind of got a lot of, I think, lay people who aren't necessarily plugged into the cinema world to say, oh, what's this? I need to look for this. Right. Any other questions, recommendations? I would just say ultimately, you can all see me. So I absolutely do not think I'm the final word on this subject. I would definitely recommend checking out those books. And there are a lot of, Black critics, Black writers. The only Black critic I would say don't listen to is Armand White. But that's more because his whole thing now is just being a contrarian rather than, I think, providing decent film criticism. I mean, this is the guy who said Paddington 2 was bad.
Liz?
Oh, yep.
This is Carol. I have a couple questions, a comment as far as
Sure.
in a movie group. I'm in a movie group in Boston, and we saw Fruitvale Station a couple weeks ago. Very, very powerful film. I would highly recommend that.
Yep.
Also a question, where would you put RuPaul in all of this?
Ooh. RuPaul is interesting because they are someone that's, they're the intersection of Black and queer, and that is its own subgenre of Black cinema. Oh, that's interesting because I when I think about RuPaul, I think more television.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
I think she definitely, I think, made drag a lot more palatable to everyday America. I have my own opinions on RuPaul now. I think I should say I think RuPaul's time is kind of past. He needs to pass the torch to other drag creatives, but I mean, you can say that and still ultimately, acknowledge that RuPaul kicked barriers down with heels. But she's someone who I think, especially when you look at the Black queer community, she probably did help make it a little bit more palatable to mainstream audiences. But I think the main takeaway of that wasn't Black queerness is okay. It was more, oh, drag is fun.
Right. One other series I watched on Netflix that I thought about, I don't know that everybody who created was Black, but Pose, the trans community.
Yes.
In the late 80s, early 90s.
Oh yeah. So Pose was created by Ryan Murphy, who is I should say, like me, pale. I like Ryan Murphy. He created American Horror Story. He's okay with me. And I don't think that, I think, there's a conversation about who is telling these stories. And ultimately in an ideal world, it wouldn't matter. Usually the question of like, you're telling our stories comes up because, you know, Black queer storytellers don't get the same opportunities as Ryan Murphy would.
Mhm.
But the one thing I will give Ryan Murphy credit for is he has hired trans writers, he hires consultants. All of the people who act on that show are queer and trans, which I think is a good job for representing people on screen. And I think, you know, he's probably doing the best he can, which is creating a show and allowing other creatives to kind of get their foot in the door. Ava DuVernay is doing something similar with Queen Sugar, where, you know, that's a show that's on the Oprah network. And what she's doing is she's like, there was actually some controversy for it when it first happened, but she goes, I only want women to direct episodes of my show. And of course, you have guys going, well, that's not fair. But she goes, men have been had an upper hand in directing for years. She goes, I want to let women who already have a harder time breaking into the industry. I know that because I've had a hard time too. I want to give women a leg up. So she's specifically using her power to help other women kind of get their foot in the door, which I think is a very admirable and good thing to do. Sorry, my house is really cold right now. I'm like, why am I cold? My house is usually warmer. But no, I would say Pose is fantastic. Is season 2 up yet? I really fell off my Netflix.
I haven't seen it. I don't know, but you segued into one other question I had. Speaking of who tells the story, and I thought about All in the Family and the spinoff, The Jeffersons.
Oh yeah.
Which was, I think, and I just looked it up, and it says Norman Lear created it, but there were other people involved. So it was a collaborative effort. Yep. It looks like.
And that's what happened in some cases with a lot of the blaxploitation movies, where the white, like Larry Cohen is someone who directed blaxploitation films, but he was like, well, I'm going to let the actors who know what they're doing and, you know, do their thing and improvise. I'm gonna let them have their authentic voice. And I mean, some of it was, again, Hollywood is getting better. It's not perfect, but if you compare it to the gatekeeping that used to happen, it's a lot better. Mm-hmm. You know, I don't want to say baby steps, but it's always a, well, in retrospect. And again, just I don't want the idea to be that like every time a white director directed a Black person or a Black story, it meant that they were completely infantilizing the characters. There are a lot of films, again, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, In the Heat of the Night, Nothing But a Man, even the adaptation of Black Like Me, you do get the sense, and even if you read the interviews, that the directors really wanted to handle the story with respect. It's just more, you know, it's just you start to wonder like, oh, did they even consider asking Ossie Davis to direct this or something? And unfortunately, the answer is usually no. Similar thing came up. Well, I thought about that recently with, if you've ever seen, great movie, but there's one flaw that sticks out, the film The Year of Living Dangerously. Sigourney Weaver, Mel Gibson. Actually, no, two things that stick out and make it a little unwatchable now. And or you watch young Mel Gibson and you're like, what happened to you? But the character, Linda Hunt's character, who plays an Indonesian man. And I was wondering, I'm like, did they even consider casting an Asian actor? And it turns out, no, they thought about getting Bob Balaban first. And my thought was just like, what was the director's thought process of we need to cast white people and put them in makeup rather than holding an open casting call? And thankfully, a film that came out a year later, The Killing Field, absolutely held an open casting call and did not make the, which would have been a disastrous decision of having a white person play an Asian character. I think that would have just made, that would have just been in such poor taste. I'm pretty sure everyone in production just said, nope, we're not doing that. Does anyone have any other questions?
Just thank you very much. That was wonderful. So much information to take in. Thank you.
That's
Great
a lot.
job, Liz.
So next month, I am going to be talking about women in cinema, or I might have to limit that one. I'll see what I can do. I can't keep you here for 3 hours. And also, I should give you all some good news. My program idea for April was approved. I am going to be talking about the history of exploitation cinema, that's going to be a fun topic.
With 2 number ones in it.
All right.
Thank you
well,
for presenting.
Oh, thank you.
Take care, Liz.
Thank
I
you
tried.
very much. Very informative. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. So again, if you'd like to join me next month, it's Women in Cinema, and hopefully May's topic will be revealed soon. I'm going back and forth on 2 ideas for it. So I hope everyone has a wonderful night, and please stay safe out there. I hope everyone's staying off the roads.
Same to you.
All right, have a good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Some of that.